The lie, like the autumn light slanting through the bay window of their South End brownstone, was beautiful. It cast a golden, forgiving glow on everything it touched: the rich mahogany of the dining table, the spines of 1,000 books lining the walls, and the face of the man Olivia Hayes had loved for 15 years. Michael sat opposite her, his hands, the same hands that could sketch a dream home from nothing, spread across a glossy portfolio. He was an architect, not just of buildings, but of narratives. Tonight, his narrative was their future. "It's a legacy project, Liv," he said, his voice a low, earnest hum that had always been her favorite sound. Net zero energy homes, sustainable materials, community-focused design. It's not just building houses, it's building a better way to live. Olivia, a senior research librarian at Boston University, traced the rim of her wine glass. Her world was one of facts, of primary sources and verifiable truths. She dealt in the quiet, dusty certainty of the past. Michael dealt in the shimmering possibility of the future. For years, their two worlds had dovetailed perfectly, creating a life that felt as solid and elegant as the 19th century brickwork of their home. "It sounds wonderful, Michael, truly." And it did. The renderings showed sleek, modern homes nestled into a green landscape, a vision of responsible, aspirational living that appealed to the part of her that believed in progress, in leaving the world better than you found it. "The investors are lined up," he continued, his blue eyes bright with an almost feverish energy she mistook for passion. "But to secure the final round of funding, we need to show more skin in the game, more capital from the firm itself." He slid a sheaf of papers across the table. The words swam before her eyes: business loan application, home equity line of credit. The numbers were staggering, figures that made the air in her lungs feel thin. They were numbers that took their beautiful, historic home, her sanctuary, the physical manifestation of their shared life, and placed it on a gambling table. A flicker of unease, as small and cold as a single snowflake, landed in the pit of her stomach. She was meticulous with their finances, balancing their budget to the penny. This was a deviation from the ordered script of their life. It was a risk she couldn't quantify. "It's a lot, Michael," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The house." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, confident. It was the touch that had steadied her through her father's illness, the touch that had celebrated her promotions, the touch she fell asleep next to every night. It was the touch of home. "I know," he said softly, "but it's us, Liv. It's an investment in us. Think of it. In 5 years, we'll be free. We can travel, you can fund that rare books archive you've always dreamed of. This is the final push, the last big climb." He was selling her a dream, and she, a lifelong romantic who curated the stories of others, wanted so desperately to believe in her own. She looked around the room, at the life they had so carefully built, the Persian rug they'd haggled for in an Istanbul market, the painting over the mantelpiece from a gallery in the Marais. Each object was a chapter in their story. What was one more chapter, even if it was frightening? Trust, she told herself, was the spine that held the whole book together. Her unease was a ghost, a whisper in a room full of assurances. She pushed it down, mistaking it for her own timidity, her own lack of vision. He was the architect, after all. He saw the finished structure, where she only saw a blueprint of risk. "Okay," she said, the word feeling both momentous and insignificant. "Okay, Michael, I trust you." He smiled, a dazzling, relieved expression that smoothed the lines of tension from his face. "You won't regret this, Liv. This is our foundation for the future." He slid the pen across the table. As she signed her name next to his, the ornate, looping script felt like a foreign language. She was co-signing not just a loan, but a narrative. And in that gilded autumn light, she had no way of knowing that the foundation Michael was building was a house of cards, and their future was a debt she would pay for in currency far more valuable than money. The weeks that followed the signing were a slow, almost imperceptible descent. The vibrant hues of autumn bled into the muted grays of late November. A chill seemed to settle not just over the city, but within the walls of their home. The house, once a warm, breathing entity, began to feel cavernous and cold. Michael was a ghost in their life. He left before she woke, the scent of his coffee a faint, mocking trace in the kitchen. He came home late, long after she'd fallen asleep with a book on her chest, the bed beside her a vast, empty expanse. When they did cross paths, he was a tightly coiled spring of stress. "The permitting process is a nightmare," he'd say, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Bureaucracy is killing this project. The contractor is trying to squeeze me for more money. The soil analysis came back with complications." His explanations were always plausible, always detailed, the kind of architecturally sound excuses that left no room for questions. Olivia, wanting to be a supportive partner, would nod, make him tea, and try to soothe the frantic energy radiating from him. But her support felt like throwing pebbles into a chasm. It made no difference. The intimacy they'd shared, a comfortable language of shared glances and easy silences, was replaced by a strained courtesy. He'd stare at his phone during their rare meals together, his thumb scrolling furiously. His phone, which had once been left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always in his pocket, screen down. He had hushed, tense conversations in his study, the door firmly closed. If she entered, he would end the call abruptly. "Just a supplier," he'd snap, his irritation a sharp slap in the quiet room. "They don't understand the meaning of a deadline." Olivia retreated into her work at the library. The hushed reverence of the reading rooms, the solid weight of books, the methodical process of research, it was a balm to her frayed nerves. Here, things made sense. Information could be cross-referenced, sources could be verified. There were no hidden clauses or emotional subtext in a 17th century manuscript. She told herself this was the pressure of ambition, the price of a legacy project. Marriages had seasons, she reasoned, and this was their winter. They just had to endure it until the spring of his success. But the feeling of wrongness persisted, a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of her life. It was in the way he avoided her eyes, the way his laughter no longer reached them. It was in the small, inexplicable discrepancies. A charge on their credit card for a restaurant in the seaport, a client dinner, he'd said, though he'd told her he was working late at the office. A new, expensive-looking watch on his wrist that he claimed was a gift from a grateful client, though he couldn't seem to remember which one. She was a researcher. Her instincts were honed to spot inconsistencies, to follow a thread of information until it led to a source. But in her own home, with her own husband, she suppressed those instincts. To investigate Michael would be a betrayal of the trust she had staked her life on. To pull at that thread was to risk unraveling everything. So she chose a state of willful blindness, a psychological self-preservation that felt both necessary and cowardly. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in early December, wedged between a gas bill and a Christmas card from her aunt. It was a single, innocuous-looking envelope, but it wasn't from their bank, nor from any of the lenders she had co-signed with. The logo was sleek and unfamiliar, a stylized S over the name Silas Capital. Her heart gave a strange, hard thump. She slit the envelope with a kitchen knife, her hand suddenly unsteady. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was an overdue notice for a loan she had no memory of, a loan with an interest rate so predatory it made her gasp, and it was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Michael Hayes. She was standing in the kitchen, the letter trembling in her hand, when Michael came home. He saw the look on her face, then his eyes darted to the paper she was holding. For a split second, a look of pure animal panic flashed across his features before he masked it with anger. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight. "It came in the mail," she said, holding it out. "Silas Capital. I've never heard of them. It says we're past due." He snatched the letter from her hand, his movements jerky and violent. He glanced at it and then crumpled it into a ball with a snarl of fury. It's a mistake, a damn clerical error from one of the subcontractors. They're trying to pin their financial mismanagement on me. A clerical error? Michael, this is a loan agreement with our names on it. The amount— I'll handle it, Olivia, he snapped, his voice a whip crack in the quiet kitchen. He had never used that tone with her before. Never. Just forget you saw it. It's business. It's messy. You don't need to worry about it. He turned and walked towards his study, the crumpled ball of paper clenched in his fist. But Olivia didn't hear the explanation. She heard the lie. It was loud, clanging, and utterly undeniable. It wasn't the anger that convinced her. It was the terror she had seen in his eyes. That night, she lay in bed, feigning sleep, listening to the rigid, tense line of his body beside her. The trust she had guarded so fiercely had not just been broken, it had been revealed as a sham. And the quiet, orderly world of Olivia Hayes, senior research librarian, shattered. In its place was a cold, terrifying silence filled with questions. The researcher in her, so long suppressed, finally awoke. She was no longer a wife protecting her marriage. She was an archivist searching for the truth in a collection of lies. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the overdue notice was not the end of the story. It was the first page. The investigation began in the dead of night, in the digital catacombs of their shared life. While Michael slept a fitful, shallow sleep beside her, Olivia slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. She took her laptop not to the kitchen, but to the guest room, a space that felt neutral, untainted by the ghosts of their recent life. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. This felt transgressive, a violation of the ultimate privacy. But the crumpled letter from Silas Capital had been a greater violation. It had redrawn the boundaries of their marriage, and she was now in uncharted, hostile territory. She started with the basics, the things she had access to as his wife: online banking portals, shared credit card statements. Her mind, trained to organize chaos and find patterns, went to work. She opened a spreadsheet, the clean, empty cells a stark contrast to the mess she was wading into. The first thread she pulled was the business loans she had co-signed. Michael had created a separate account for the firm, one he managed exclusively to keep things clean. She had the account number from the loan documents. Logging in required answering a security question. What was the name of your first pet? Buddy, a golden retriever from his childhood. The answer came to her instantly, a relic of their early dating days, of sharing stories and building a shared history. The intimacy of the memory felt like a fresh betrayal. The account opened. She expected to see large outflows to contractors, to material suppliers, to architectural software companies. She saw some of those, small amounts that looked like a smokescreen, but the vast majority of the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, was moving in a completely different direction. She saw massive, recurring wire transfers to an entity she didn't recognize, IR Consulting. There were huge payments to high-end credit card accounts she'd never seen before. And then she saw it, a repeating monthly transfer, labeled Seaport Residence Lease. It was for a staggering amount, enough to rent a lavish penthouse overlooking the harbor. Her breath hitched. A client dinner. The lie echoed in the silent room. This wasn't a business account. It was a slush fund. The name IR Consulting snagged in her mind. IR. The initials felt significant. She opened a new browser tab, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A simple public records search. She cross-referenced the address of the Seaport residence with business filings. The result appeared on her screen, stark and brutal. IR Consulting. Principal, Isabella Rossi. Isabella. The name was beautiful, exotic. Olivia typed it into a social media search bar. A public profile appeared. A woman with long, dark hair, a dazzling smile, and eyes that seemed to hold a world of secrets. Her page was a curated gallery of a life of luxury: champagne flutes on a yacht, shopping bags from Chanel, art gallery openings. In one photo, from 2 months ago, she was laughing at a waterfront restaurant in the Seaport. Reflected in the window behind her, blurry but unmistakable, was Michael's profile. A wave of nausea washed over Olivia. It wasn't just physical sickness. It was a profound, soul-deep revulsion. The lies were not just financial, they were intimate. The distant, stressed man she'd been living with wasn't pouring his soul into a legacy project. He was pouring their money, their future, her signature on loan documents, into another woman's life. The betrayal was so vast, so complete, it was almost abstract. It was like looking at an aerial map of an earthquake zone. She could see the fault lines, the collapsed structures, but she couldn't yet process the human toll, her own. She worked through the night, fueled by a cold, clinical rage. Every click of the mouse, every new discovery was another shovelful of earth on the grave of her marriage. She found the credit card statements for the accounts paid from the slush fund. They told a story of expensive dinners she'd never attended, hotel suites in New York she'd never slept in, and a receipt from a jewelry store for a diamond bracelet purchased on their anniversary. The anniversary they had celebrated with a quiet takeout meal at home because Michael was too swamped to go out. The sun was beginning to cast a pale, wintry light over the city when she found the final piece. Buried in a subfolder on their shared cloud drive, mislabeled Old Tax Docs, was a file she'd never seen before. It was a loan agreement. The lender was Silas Capital. It was dated 2 years prior, long before the legacy project was ever mentioned. The borrower was Michael Hayes, solely. The amount was enormous, and the terms were extortionate. It was a predator's contract. Suddenly, the timeline clicked into place. This was the original sin. The debt to Silas Capital came first. The story of the legacy project, the new loans she had co-signed, that wasn't for expansion. It was a bailout, a desperate, fraudulent scheme to use new, legitimate debt to pay off an older, illegitimate one. And Isabella Rossi? Was she the cause of the debt or a consequence of it? Was she a co-conspirator or just another expensive part of the life he was funding with lies? At that moment, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the sheer, breathtaking scale of the deception. Michael had not just cheated on her, he had systematically dismantled their life, brick by brick, lie by lie, and used her trust as his primary demolition tool. She closed the laptop. The guest room was freezing, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the truth. The image of their brownstone, her beloved sanctuary, flashed in her mind. It was no longer a home. It was a stage, a crime scene, and she was its primary victim. She walked back to their bedroom. Michael was still asleep, his face relaxed, almost innocent in the morning light. The sight of him filled her with an emotion so cold and pure, it felt like a physical object in her chest. It was not anger or sadness. It was a quiet, profound contempt. She did not wake him. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began to print. Page after page slid from the machine. The bank statements, the wire transfers, the credit card bills, the rental agreement for the Seaport apartment, the smiling photos of Isabella Rossi, the original loan from Silas Capital. She worked with the methodical calm of a librarian preparing an exhibit. She arranged the documents on the gleaming mahogany of their dining room table. It was a timeline of their ruin, a factual indictment that required no commentary. Each piece of paper was a nail in the coffin of their 15-year marriage. When she was done, she stood back and looked at her work. The golden autumn light was long gone. The room was filled with the stark, unforgiving light of a winter morning. It was the light of truth, and it was devastating. She sat down in her usual chair, folded her hands on the table before her, and waited for the architect of all this debt and deceit to wake up and face his creation. Michael came downstairs an hour later, whistling softly. He was showered, dressed in a crisp shirt, the picture of a man ready to conquer the day. He stopped dead in the dining room doorway. The whistling died on his lips. His eyes scanned the table, a slow, horrifying sweep from left to right. He saw the bank statements, the photo of Isabella, the damning letterhead of Silas Capital. His face, which Olivia had once considered the kindest face in the world, went through a rapid, ugly transformation. The charming confidence drained away, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed shock. Then came the flush of guilt, a deep, blotchy red that crawled up his neck. Finally, it settled into the familiar, hunted look of pure terror. He looked at Olivia. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands folded. She looked like a judge, or an executioner. The silence in the room was immense, a physical pressure. It was the silence of a vacuum, where all the air, all the love, all the shared history had been sucked out. "Liv," he began, his voice a dry, cracking sound. I can explain." Olivia said nothing. She simply gestured with one hand towards the table, an invitation for him to walk through the wreckage he had created. There was no rage in her expression, no tears, just a vast, empty stillness that was more terrifying than any outburst. He stumbled to the table, his hands hovering over the papers as if they were radioactive. He picked up the photo of Isabella, then dropped it as if it had burned him. It's not what it looks like," he stammered, the words hollow and absurd in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Finally, Olivia spoke. Her voice was low and devoid of all emotion. It was the voice she used at the library to request the return of a long-overdue book. "Then tell me what it is, Michael. I'm a researcher. I appreciate primary sources. Explain the wire transfers to IR Consulting. Explain the rent for an apartment I've never seen. Explain the bracelet you bought on our anniversary for a woman named Isabella. Explain why you used our home, my trust, to pay for it all. Explain it, fact by fact." Every word was a precision strike. He flinched physically at each question. The architect, the master of persuasion, had no blueprint for this. His structures had failed. "I'm so sorry, Liv," he whispered, sinking into a chair opposite her. He buried his face in his hands. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry is a feeling," Olivia stated, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "I'm interested in the facts. The affair is a fact. The financial deceit is a fact. But there's one fact here I don't understand." She slid the 2-year-old loan agreement from Silas Capital to the center of the table. This came first. This is the foundation of the rot. What is this?" Michael looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a despair so profound it was almost bottomless. The carefully constructed walls of his life were not just cracking, they were collapsing in on him. "It was a project," he said, his voice ragged. "Before all this, a development in the suburbs. It looked perfect, a sure thing, but I was over-leveraged. The banks wouldn't touch me. A colleague, he introduced me to Silas. He spoke of Mr. Silas not as a person, but as a force, a solution that appeared when all others had vanished. Silas offered him the capital he needed, no questions asked, at an interest rate that seemed manageable if everything went right. But nothing went right," Michael continued, his gaze fixed on the table, unable to meet Olivia's. "The zoning fell through, the market dipped, the whole project imploded. I was ruined. But you can't declare bankruptcy on a man like Silas. You don't default on him." The room grew colder. Olivia could feel the presence of this unseen man, this Mr. Silas, seeping into the air. "He didn't send thugs with baseball bats, Liv. It wasn't like the movies. It was worse." Michael's voice dropped to a near whisper. "It was phone calls, quiet meetings in coffee shops. He knew where you worked. He knew your schedule. He knew your aunt lived in Vermont. He never threatened you directly. He'd just say things like, It would be a shame for such a stable life to become unstable. Or, you have a beautiful home. We must protect our beautiful things. Olivia felt a tremor of fear, the first emotion to pierce her icy calm. It was a cold, alien dread. "And Isabella?" she asked, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Michael let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, a truly broken noise. Isabella? She was part of it. At first, I thought she was just someone I met. It felt like an escape. She was exciting. She didn't know how much trouble I was in. But then I realized Silas introduced her to my circle. He put her in my path. I don't know if she was a honey trap or just another person he owned. Maybe both. Her consulting firm was just a way for him to bleed me dry, to funnel the money out. He made my debt a part of my lifestyle. He made me pay for my own prison. The full, monstrous picture finally swam into focus for Olivia. It wasn't a simple story of infidelity. It was a complex, horrifying tapestry of weakness, fear, and manipulation. The new loans, the ones with her name on them, were not for a new woman. They were a desperate, frantic attempt to feed a monster. Michael had betrayed her to save himself, sacrificing her on the altar of his own terror. He was a liar, a cheat, a thief who had stolen their future. But as she looked at his wrecked, terrified face, she saw something else, too. He was a victim, a man so far out of his depth he was drowning, and in his panic, he had pulled her under with him. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could she hold two such opposing truths in her mind at once? The man she despised for his betrayal was the same man she felt a sliver of terrifying pity for. Her perpetrator was also a captive. As if on cue, a phone buzzed, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. It was Michael's phone, lying face up on the table. The screen lit up with a single name: Silas. Michael stared at it, his face ashen. The phone buzzed again, insistent. He looked at Olivia, his eyes pleading for what? Forgiveness? An answer? She just stared back, her expression unreadable. With a trembling hand, he picked up the phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, and then, in a gesture of final, utter surrender, he pressed the icon for the speaker. A voice filled the room. It was not gruff or menacing. It was calm, cultured, and utterly chilling. It was the voice of absolute control. "Michael," the voice said, as smoothly as poured silk, "I trust your wife is now fully appraised of our partnership." There was a slight pause, pregnant with meaning. "The next payment is due Friday. No more delays." The line went dead. The threat was no longer a story. It was no longer a name on a piece of paper. It was here, in their dining room, hanging in the air between them. The beautiful, historic brownstone, Olivia's cherished home, had ceased to be a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage, and she had just realized the door had been locked from the outside. The hours after the phone call were a blur of fractured reality. The chilling finality of Mr. Silas's voice had severed the last tenuous thread connecting Olivia to the life she once knew. There was no more room for doubt, no space for the complex tangle of pity and rage. There was only the primal, instinctual need for escape. While Michael sat catatonic at the dining room table, a ghost at a feast of his own ruin, Olivia moved with a strange, detached efficiency. She went upstairs to their bedroom, the room that held 15 years of shared memories, and saw it now as a museum of a dead relationship. She opened her closet and pulled out a suitcase. She packed methodically, her hands moving on autopilot. A week's worth of practical, sensible clothes, her toiletries, the worn paperback copy of Middlemarch that she reread every few years. She did not pack the expensive dress he'd bought her for their 10th anniversary, nor the jewelry he'd given her. She was shedding a skin, and she would take nothing of that life with her. When she was done, she stood in the doorway and looked back. The room, bathed in the cold light of a December afternoon, looked staged, impersonal, a house of mirrors reflecting a life that was never truly real. She walked downstairs, pulling the small suitcase behind her. Michael hadn't moved. He looked up as she approached, his eyes hollow. "Liv, where are you going?" he asked, his voice weak. "I'm going to Chloe's," she said. The words were flat, informational. "My lawyer." The word lawyer hung in the air, sharp and clinical. It was the sound of a door closing, of a line being irrevocably drawn. "Please," he begged, starting to rise from his chair. "Don't leave. We can figure this out. I can fix this." Olivia stopped and looked at him, truly looked at him, for the last time as his wife. She saw the pathetic desperation, the terror of being left alone to face the monster he'd invited into their lives. "You can't fix this, Michael," she said, and for the first time, a flicker of her own pain broke through the icy calm. "You don't fix a demolition. You just survey the rubble. I gave you my trust. You used it as collateral for a life you were living with someone else. And you handed the keys to our life, to my life, over to a criminal. There is nothing left to fix." She turned and walked out the heavy oak door without looking back. The click of the lock behind her was the most definitive sound she had ever heard. The cold Boston air hit her face, and for the first time in hours, she took a full, deep breath. It was a breath of frigid, painful freedom. Chloe Kim lived in a sleek, minimalistic apartment in Cambridge that was the architectural and emotional opposite of Olivia's brownstone. It was all glass and steel and clean lines, a place with no shadows and no secrets. When she opened the door and saw Olivia standing there, suitcase in hand, her face a mask of grief, she didn't ask questions. She simply opened her arms. Olivia collapsed into the hug, and the rigid control she had maintained for the past 24 hours finally broke. Sobs tore through her, dry, racking sounds of pure, undiluted anguish. It was the sound of a heart breaking, not with a clean snap, but with a grinding, tearing motion. Chloe just held her, her own pragmatism softening into a fierce, protective warmth. The days that followed bled into a desolate winter of the soul. Olivia slept on Chloe's sofa, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of her friend's uncomplicated kindness. She existed in a fog of shock and grief. Sleep offered no escape. It was filled with nightmares of a calm, smiling Mr. Silas sitting at her library desk, stamping all her books as overdue. Waking hours were worse. She was haunted by the phantom limb of her marriage, the instinct to turn and tell Michael something she'd read, the muscle memory of listening for his key in the lock. The grief was not just for the man she thought he was, but for the woman she had been with him, trusting, safe, and blissfully unaware. Chloe was her anchor. She was a lawyer, and she approached Olivia's crisis with a combination of empathy and strategic precision. "Okay," she said one evening, sitting opposite Olivia with a notepad and a cup of steaming tea. "We need 2 tracks here. Track 1 is legal and financial triage. Track 2 is you." Track 1 was a nightmare. Chloe brought in a forensic accountant. Together, they mapped the financial devastation. The loans, the helllock, the hidden debts. It was a catastrophic mess. Foreclosure notices began to arrive at the brownstone, which Michael forwarded to Chloe's office in limp, defeated envelopes. The beautiful home, their biggest asset, was now their greatest liability, an anchor pulling them down into a sea of debt. "Bankruptcy is an option," Chloe said gently, seeing the look of horror on Olivia's face. "It's not a moral failing, Liv. It's a legal tool. It's a way to cauterize the wound." But track 2 was the harder, more painful work. On Chloe's firm recommendation, Olivia made an appointment with a therapist, Dr. Anya Sharma. Her office was a quiet, warm space filled with soft light and comfortable chairs, a deliberate sanctuary from the harsh realities outside. Olivia sat in one of those chairs, feeling exposed and raw. She began to talk, the words spilling out in a jumbled, chaotic torrent. The lies, the affair, the spreadsheets, the chilling voice on the phone. Dr. Sharma listened patiently, her presence a calm, non-judgmental space. "Olivia," she said after a long silence, "you're experiencing a complex trauma. It's not just the betrayal of an affair, it's a fundamental violation of your reality. The man you trusted to build your home, literally and figuratively, was actively demolishing it. And on top of that, you've discovered he is both your perpetrator and a victim himself." "I don't know what to feel," Olivia confessed, her voice thick. "I hate him. I look at what he did to me, to us, and I feel a rage that is so cold it burns. But then I see his face when that phone rang, and I see this terrified, pathetic man, and I feel, I don't know, a horrible, sick pity. How can I feel pity for the man who destroyed my life?" "Because your empathy is still intact, even if your trust is not," Dr. Sharma explained. "Holding those two conflicting ideas, your justifiable anger and your compassion for his suffering, is an incredibly difficult psychological task. It creates a state of cognitive dissonance. The healing process isn't about choosing one feeling over the other. It's about learning to hold both, to acknowledge the full, messy, complicated truth of the situation." The sessions were grueling. They picked apart the fabric of her identity. For so long, she had been Olivia and Michael. Now, she was just Olivia. The name felt incomplete. Who was she, if not his wife? What did she want, if not the shared dream he had sold her? The fear of Mr. Silas was a constant, low-grade fever. She'd jump when the phone rang, she'd scan the faces of strangers on the T, wondering if they were watching her. The threat was invisible, which made it feel omnipresent. She was living in a psychological thriller she had never asked to be in. The Boston winter deepened, burying the city in snow and ice. The world outside Chloe's window was bleak and frozen, a perfect mirror for Olivia's inner landscape. Her life, once a meticulously curated collection, was now a pile of rubble. And as she sat in the quiet of Dr. Sharma's office or the sanctuary of Chloe's apartment, she knew the hardest work was yet to come, sifting through that rubble, piece by painful piece, to see if there was anything left worth salvaging. Not of her marriage, but of herself. The turning point did not arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic revelation. It came quietly, in the sterile environment of a lawyer's conference room, 4 months after she had walked out of her home. The air was thick with the scent of paper and unspoken animosity. Michael sat on the other side of a long, polished table, represented by a harried-looking public defender. He looked gaunt, a hollowed-out version of the charismatic man she had married. The charm was gone, replaced by the dull sheen of defeat. They were there to sign the papers for the short sale of the brownstone. The bank, prodded by Chloe's relentless negotiations, had agreed to it as a way to avoid a protracted foreclosure. It meant selling the house for less than the mortgages owed, a brutal financial concession, but a necessary one. As her lawyer slid the document in front of her, Olivia looked at the address printed at the top. It was just a string of words and numbers, but it represented the entire architecture of her former life. The dream of growing old there, of filling its rooms with laughter and grandchildren, of it being a bastion against the world, all of it, dissolved into the cold, legalistic language of the contract. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. This was it, the final amputation. The act of signing away not just a property, but a future. She looked across the table at Michael. He was watching her, his eyes filled with a miserable cocktail of regret and self-pity. For a moment, the old impulse to comfort him, to ease his pain, flickered within her. Then she looked down at the pen in her own hand, and she thought of Dr. Sharma's words from their last session. You cannot be the caretaker of his pain, Olivia. You have your own to carry. Your only responsibility now is to your own survival." In that instant, something shifted. The flicker of pity for him was extinguished by a surge of something else, a fierce, protective instinct for herself. She was not his keeper. She was not the collateral in his tragic story. She was the protagonist of her own. With a firm, steady hand, she signed her name. The looping script was no longer foreign. It was hers. It was an act of severance, but it was also an act of self-reclamation. As she pushed the paper back across the table, she felt a profound, painful, and deeply cleansing sense of release, a weight she didn't even realize she had been carrying. The last vestige of hope for a life that was already dead lifted from her shoulders. Selling the house was the first step in building a new life. It was a life of radical reduction. With the proceeds of the sale gone to the banks and a personal bankruptcy filing insulating her from the worst of the debt Michael had saddled her with, she was left with very little. She moved out of Chloe's spare room and into a small, one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, not far from the university. The apartment was a blank slate. The walls were white, the rooms echoed with emptiness. For the first week, she slept on an air mattress on the floor, surrounded by the few boxes of books and clothes she had salvaged. The silence was deafening. There was no ghost of Michael here, no memory in the walls. It was terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. Slowly, she began to build. Not with mahogany and Persian rugs, but with small, deliberate acts of self-definition. She bought a simple, sturdy wooden bed frame and assembled it herself. The instructions spread out on the floor, the feeling of the Allen key in her hand a small, satisfying anchor. She painted one wall of the living room a deep, calming blue, a color that was hers alone. She spent a Saturday afternoon in a used bookstore and came home with a stack of novels, filling a small bookshelf that became the new heart of her home. Her work at the library became less of an escape and more of a sanctuary. The quiet order, the pursuit of knowledge, the tangible history in her hands, it grounded her. She found a deep, abiding solace in the company of books and the gentle hum of the reading room. Her colleagues, who knew only that she was going through a difficult divorce, treated her with a quiet, respectful kindness that was a balm to her bruised soul. The fear of Mr. Silas receded. Through Chloe, she learned that Michael, facing federal charges for bank fraud, had agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He provided them with a detailed account of Silas's loan sharking and money laundering operation. Olivia, protected by a layer of lawyers, anonymously corroborated key details, providing copies of the documents she had so methodically collected on that fateful morning. She was a researcher, and her skills had given her a unique form of power. She would likely never know the outcome of the investigation, and she was content with that. Her role in that dark story was over. Her sessions with Dr. Sharma continued, but their focus shifted from dissecting the trauma to constructing a future. "Who are you now, Olivia?" Dr. Sharma asked one afternoon. Olivia thought for a moment, looking out the window at the first tentative green buds on the trees. Spring had arrived, a season she once thought she might not live to see with any sense of hope. "I'm a librarian," she said, the words simple but solid. "I'm a good friend. I'm a woman who can assemble her own furniture." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I'm a survivor." She started doing things she had put off for years, things that had been subsumed by the we of her marriage. She joined a weekend hiking club, finding a surprising peace in the physical exertion and the sweeping views from the top of a mountain. She took a pottery class, delighting in the messy, imperfect process of shaping a lump of clay into something new. She was creating things that were lopsided and flawed, but they were hers. One Saturday evening in May, she was sitting by the window in her small apartment. The deep blue wall was behind her, the air smelled of rain-washed streets and blooming lilacs. A cup of tea warmed her hands. Her apartment was no longer empty. It was filled with books, a lopsided pot holding a thriving fern, and a quiet sense of peace she had earned. She had not heard from Michael directly since the signing. She knew, through Chloe, that he had been sentenced to a minimum security prison. She felt a distant, detached sadness for the waste of his life, but it was the sadness one feels for a character in a book whose fatal flaws lead to his inevitable downfall. It no longer had the power to wound her. She looked around her small, quiet kingdom. It was not the grand, gilded life she had dreamed of in the brownstone. There was no architect husband, no legacy projects, no promise of a dazzling shared future. It was smaller, simpler, and infinitely more real. The foundation was not a lie. It was built on the bedrock of her own resilience. She was scarred, yes. The memory of the betrayal would always be a part of her history, a volume in the library of her life she could not unwrite. But it was no longer the only book on the shelf. She had started a new collection. The sun set, painting the Boston sky in hues of pink and orange. Olivia watched it, not with the melancholic longing of the past, but with a calm, quiet appreciation for the beauty of the present moment. She was not healed, not in the way a broken bone mends, leaving no trace of the injury. She was reformed, reshaped by the fire she had walked through. And in the quiet solitude of her own life, a life she had built from the rebel, she was, for the first time, truly, unshakably at home.